a solid dynamics, fluid dynamics, and topological method for understanding chronic disease trajectories, number 1485, VPT Sharp 046, December 30, 2025. Gerald C. EclaireMD Foundation. Category: Research Methodology. Preface: My academic and intellectual path did not follow a conventional timeline. It was shaped early by historical disruption, accelerated responsibility, and continuous self-driven learning, rather than by orderly institutional progression. I was admitted into an elementary school in Taiwan when I was 4 years old because my family records were lost during the China Civil War between 1945 and 1949. As a result, my age could not be formally verified through standard documentation, and I entered the education system 2 years earlier than usual. This early start placed me on an accelerated academic track from childhood, one that required adapting quickly to structured learning environments before emotional or social maturity typically develops. By age 16, I had already begun my undergraduate studies in applied mathematics in Taiwan. Rather than following age-based expectations, my coursework reflected the demands of advanced logical, mathematical, and physical reasoning at a young age. To illustrate this progression clearly, I list several representative key courses alongside the age at which I studied them. At age 17, I studied complex variables and partial differential equations. At age 18, I studied fluid mechanics and elasticity. At age 19, I studied vibration mechanics and topology. These subjects were not treated as abstract academic exercises. They trained my mind to think in terms of continuity, structure, deformation, flow, and stability. They also formed the earliest foundation of my later systems-based thinking. Long before I entered medicine or biomedical research at the age of 63, I came to the United States at age 21. My formal education did not stop there. I completed the required coursework for 2 additional undergraduate programs, computer science and mechanical engineering, at the University of Iowa. Over my first 14 years in the United States, I continued my studies at 5 different universities. During this period, my focus expanded beyond mathematics into various engineering disciplines, computer science, and business management, including economics and marketing. This phase of my life emphasized breadth as well as depth, combining analytical rigor with real-world system constraints, organizational behavior, and decision-making under pressure. After selling my successful semiconductor company, from 2001 through 2009, I entered a very different but equally demanding phase of self-education. I spent 9 years in intensive self-study of psychology, with particular interest in various personality disorders. This was not an abstract intellectual pursuit. During the same period, I was actively conducting charitable programs that provided long-term care and support for approximately 250 abandoned children and abused women. These experiences exposed me to the human consequences of trauma, behavioral pathology, and social neglect, grounding psychological theory in lived reality. Beginning in 2010 and continuing through now, 2025, I have devoted the past 16 years to the self-study and research of internal medicine. This work emerged not from academic ambition, but from necessity, survival, and repeated confrontation with my personal health challenges. My focus has been especially directed toward metabolic disorder-induced diseases that led to 9 separate mortality-related medical incidents. These conditions evolve slowly, accumulate damage silently, and ultimately manifest as catastrophic events if they are not understood as long-term processes. Taken together, this timeline reflects a continuous learning trajectory, rather than a series of isolated academic stages. Mathematics, physics, engineering, psychology, charitable service, and internal medicine are not separate chapters in my life. They are interconnected layers of a single, evolving effort to understand complex systems, human vulnerability, and the mathematical models and physical laws that govern health, disease progression, and failure. Introduction. Over the past 16 years of intensive self-study and longitudinal medical research, I gradually realized that most chronic diseases do not behave like static biological conditions. They behave like fluid-flowing systems. They evolve continuously. They accelerate, decelerate, stabilize, or collapse. Their damage accumulates through time, rather than appearing suddenly at diagnosis. This realization led me to a new methodological insight. Much of my medical research can be understood, illustrated, and explained using a fluid dynamics viewpoint, meaning I treat physiology as time-dependent flow with changing pressure, velocity, resistance, viscosity, pulsatility, and energy dissipation, combined with solid dynamics insight into stress, strain, fatigue, viscoplastic deformation, and eventual fracture, and topology to describe shape, continuity, connectivity, and irreversible transitions. This was not a theoretical choice made in advance. It emerged naturally from observing real data collected from my own body, day after day, year after year. This article describes that methodology clearly, step by step. Why I began thinking in fluid terms. My research is built on three defining characteristics. First, time matters. I do not study isolated clinic visits. I study continuous trajectories across years and decades. Second, the variables I track are continuous physiological processes. Blood glucose, blood pressure, lipid transport, body weight, sleep balance, walking activity, oxygen delivery, and metabolic energy are not discrete events. They are flows. Third, health outcomes are determined not by snapshots, but by rates, accumulation, and thresholds. The speed of change often matters more than the absolute value. Cumulative damage matters more than a single measurement. These three features naturally align with fluid dynamics thinking. In fluid systems, state matters, but rate matters more. Energy is dissipated continuously. Small instabilities, if sustained, lead to regime shifts. Recovery is possible early, but becomes harder as dissipation accumulates. When I looked back at my own research results, I saw the same patterns repeatedly. Early high energy phases, turning points, stabilization periods, sudden transitions. These are not random biological behaviors. They are flow behaviors. What fluid dynamics explains well. In my work, a fluid dynamics viewpoint explains processes that involve regulation, transport, and adaptation. Metabolic control behaves like flow regulation. Blood pressure behaves like a pulsatile wave moving through deformable channels. Insulin resistance behaves like increasing flow resistance. Sleep balance behaves like a recovery reservoir. Walking activity behaves like circulation assistance. Aging behaves like a slow increase in system viscosity. All of these processes are dynamic, time-dependent, and partially reversible. They respond strongly to changes in rate. Slowing damage often matters more than reducing magnitude. This is why lifestyle intervention works best early. It changes flow behavior before structural failure occurs, where fluid dynamics must stop. However, I also learned that not everything should be explained using fluid language. Some outcomes represent solid mechanics, not fluid regulation. Fibrosis, calcification, scarring, neuronal loss, retinal damage, kidney, scarring, and stroke lesions are structural changes. They represent irreversible deformation of biological material. Once these occur, flow models alone are insufficient. This boundary is critical. In my own research, diabetes control, blood pressure regulation, sleep improvement, and exercise recovery belong to the fluid regime, where change is continuous, reversible, and strongly time-dependent. Stroke lesions, vascular calcification, chronic kidney disease, scarring, neuropathy, and retinopathy belong to the solid regime, where damage accumulates, deforms structure, and becomes largely irreversible. Importantly, I had already followed this distinction, instinctively and implicitly throughout my research work. I simply had not recognized or named it explicitly until later. The unified two-stage model. When viewed correctly, my entire body of research fits a two-stage system. Stage 1 is the fluid regime. This is the upstream phase. Flow is misregulated. Strain rate is high. Energy dissipation accumulates. Damage is still largely reversible. Stage 2 is the solid regime. This is the downstream phase. Damage has accumulated. Structural deformation has occurred. Reversibility is limited. Stroke sits at the fluid to solid transition. Diabetes reversal sits squarely in the fluid regime. Chronic complications emerge when fluid misregulation persists long enough to produce solid damage. This ordering explains why early intervention works, why late intervention struggles, and why rate control often beats magnitude control. Where topology enters the method. Topology completes this methodology by describing geometric shape, data point continuity, and irreversible transitions. In topology, what matters is not exact values, but how a system evolves without breaking. Smooth trajectories represent stable flow. Sharp bends represent instability. Loops represent oscillation. Discontinuities represent failure. When fluid misregulation persists, the shape of the trajectory gradually changes. Smooth paths become distorted, and flow channels narrow. Eventually, a topological break occurs, representing collapse or rupture in the solid dynamics domain. This break corresponds to a clinical event, such as stroke, organ failure, or another irreversible complication. Topology allows me to describe disease progression as a shape-changing process, not just a numerical trend. It explains why two patients with similar averages can have very different health outcomes. Their trajectories have different shapes. Step-by-step method definition. Step 1. Identify the system as a continuous process evolving in time. Reject snapshot thinking. Step 2. Classify variables as flow-related or structure-related. Do not mix them prematurely. Step 3. Analyze rates of change, not just absolute levels. Strain rate is often the primary driver. Step 4. Quantify cumulative energy or load over time. Accumulation predicts failure better than averages. Step 5. Track trajectory shape using topological intuition. Look for bends, accelerations, and instability. Step 6. Identify the fluid to solid transition. This marks loss of reversibility or irreversibility. Step 7. Apply intervention upstream whenever possible. Once structural damage dominates, expectations must change. Why this strengthens my medical research. This research methodology does not weaken my work, it strengthens it by placing mechanisms in correct causal order. Fluid pathology causes solid pathology. That single sentence explains decades of confusion. In chronic disease management, it explains why early lifestyle change is powerful, why late treatment is limited, and why population averages fail to protect individuals. It also explains why my research feels coherent across diseases. Over the past 16 years, I have been studying the same underlying system, as it appears through different manifestations, across hundreds of disease manifestations. Conclusion: almost all of my medical research can be illustrated through a combined view of fluid dynamics and solid dynamics, although not all phenomena should be explained exclusively in those terms. The value of this methodology lies in recognizing which language applies at each stage of disease progression and in using topology as a separate lens to identify the irreversible boundary between reversible flow, behavior and permanent structural damage. I now recognize that this distinction has guided my medical research for years. Only recently have I identified it explicitly, and named it the fluid-solid regime switch. This article presents a unified framework for understanding chronic disease trajectories, in which time-dependent flow misregulation precedes structural damage. Topology describes how disease trajectories change shape over time, and where irreversible transitions occur. The methodology is expressed in plain language while preserving mechanical rigor, allowing clear separation of fluid regulation, solid pathology, and their causal relationship. Personal background is included only to explain how this framework emerged. At its core, the framework follows correct causal ordering. Fluid misregulation drives solid structural pathology. This principle applies consistently across diverse, chronic disease manifestations. Disclaimer: I write this article not for fame, but to share what I have learned, so others can understand complex systems, prevent failure, and live better lives. This content is provided for educational reference only, and does not constitute medical advice. No doctor-patient relationship is created. You may share this article freely, but it must not be altered, edited, or republished as your own. All intellectual property rights and copyrights belong to the author. Gerald C.